i.e. slave in his family, who sang this mournful dirge to Antinomo, the Narragansett sachem who was dispatched by Uncas with our permission. And he said that was what decided him at an early age that he was going to take up the cause of the colored and oppressed people in the world. But he didn't think of that himself. He had a little nudge, maybe more than a little nudge. And how can we recover that? I don't know. But we do have to sort of think more in depth about these things than the surface. All right, sorry, did I go over?
Yep, you did.
The library is still open though. And I would take questions if I can answer
We're open
them.
till 8, you got plenty of time.
Faye.
Well, so just thinking back to the how the collection ended up at URI's, because of their residence in Kingston, or
Yes.
who donated that? What generation donated that collection?
Apparently the stuff was left behind in the house when the family vacated it, or it was like no longer being used by them.
Ah,
They found it was found there and turned over to, I think, the Kingston Public Library. And then the library turned it over to URI. Whether or not the library kept any material, I don't know.
yeah.
In the manuscript librarian at URI was not sure either. So it's kind of fortuitous.
Yeah.
Obviously, they've been saved for several generations, but I don't know exactly. I think the house there, they had a name for it. They called it Little Rest. Sort of an interesting pun.
No, that's Little Rest is the name of the neighborhood.
Oh.
Yeah, it's that corner, which is the historic center of Kingston, Rhode Island, which
Okay.
has been feuding with URI forever and ever,
Right.
which is why there are no stores. There are no just like stores kept out stores for so many years, and it's even more dramatic that near URI there's no commercial development. That little tiny corner is called Little Rest.
Okay. Well, they refer to it in some of these letters as Little Rest.
Right.
I thought they were referring to the house.
No,
They're referring
but
to the
it's,
neighborhood.
yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, neighborhood, really, truly a four-corner. There's a wishing well there still. That's it, and some of the houses are still there.
Okay, but it's just fortuitous.
Yeah.
I think the Fairweathers had been established there before.
Oh, the Fairweathers.
His father was a blacksmith
Oh,
there.
yeah.
So that. Yeah.
Well, and there was a long history of blacksmithing going back to colonial times. African American blacksmiths. You had Isaac Glasgow, who made whaling gear early
So you have
19th
good
century.
market.
Yes, well, and his whaling gear was very much sought after. And don't forget, in New Bedford, you had Lewis Temple. The Temple toggle, the harpoon that revolutionized the whaling industry, was invented by a blacksmith who never patented it, never made any money off of it. But sort of the problem with harpoons was they pull out of the whale. The toggle would turn, and not good for whales, but great for the industry.
You mentioned Anderson, so Linda Harris Anderson, that she was related to other slave family from New London. Is she related to Susan Anderson?
I'm not sure. Her husband William, his father was Scipio, and his mother was, I think, Jane Palms. And then Scipio's father was also Scipio, I think. His grandmother was Juno, who in fact was an enslaved person in New London. Both Scipio and Juno had been enslaved. I think Scipio was freed first, and then Juno later. So there's that goes back well into the.
The one I'm thinking of, Susan Anderson, was married to Caesar Anderson, I think.
Okay.
and the reason I mention that is that she was emancipated by Captain John Deschamps the same day, and by the same person as Ichabod Pease. Deschamps owned both of them.
Right, right.
Yeah, but it's not the same, image.
I'm more familiar with emancipations in Norwich than New London, but the wonderful thing is that the emancipations are often in the land records.
Yes.
Because, you know,
Property.
we're in New England. This is a society that is obsessed with property and owning things. And so, you know, people get put in the land records as well as pieces of property.
What was the year that the come-outers, you mentioned Mary Hempstead and Celinda? What year was that? You know?
No, I think it's in the early 1840s. I would refer you to Betty Morrison, wrote a history of the Second Congregational Church. She uncovered that incident. I don't have it with me, but I think there's also material, the Hempstead papers, which are now at the London County Historical Society, are a wealth of information. Because the Hempsteads,
Besides,
you know,
they just die, right?
the
Civilian Haley also in that same.
Yeah, Civilian Haley was in that same group. But ironically, you know, the Hempsteads were very, very much aware that Joshua Hempstead had held Adam Jackson as a slave for, you know, decades and decades. I think they were ashamed of it. But they certainly, by the 1840s, have become pretty militantly anti-slavery. And in fact, we know they are assisting escaped slaves. There's a really great little document trail where, I think it's Mary, one of the Hempsteads writes to, is it Lydia Maria Child? It's one of the big names up in the Boston area. They have a couple that are living in New London, escaped from slavery in, I think it's Georgia, yes, in Savannah. They have a son still there in slavery. They're trying to get this son out. So they wanted her to write a letter to the slave owner. And so the advice that comes down from Massachusetts, by no means send a letter from New London to the slave owner, because they will track it right back. And before you know it, there'll be slave catchers there, and these folks will be gone. They said, have someone write from, we can have someone write from up here, from somewhere else, make the inquiry. So they actually exchange letters with these folks in the South, and the folks say, oh, so, you know, what's her name, you know, wants their child back? Well, no, we're not going to do that. You know, they were a terrible slave. They were an awful servant, and you know, no good, and so forth, but we want them back. I mean, here they complain about what an awful slave this person was, and yet they make it very clear that they will do anything to get this person back. So if they're so bad, why do they want it back? So, I mean, the Hempsteads are definitely, you know, and of course that whole New Guinea neighborhood, that right around the jail, you have that black settlement that, you know, Civilian Haley is very much involved in creating. You know, and that's right down from right up from the Hempstead house. Haley is down the street. It's a very interesting kind of combination of things, and my suspicion is that you know, the Fairweathers and the Andersons are up to their necks in this too.
Right.
But you're never going to find that out. You're never going to find it out because, you know, by the 1850s, if you're black and you're caught helping an escaped slave, well, you are toast. Toast, toast, toast. You're not going to save any evidence. You know, you've got the potential of being jailed, enormous fines, even worse than that, the potential of yourself being accused of being a slave and hauled down to the South in chains. Look at 12
Well,
years
use
of
the
slave.
slave, yes.
know, that's just what David Ruggles from Norwich was fighting against, you know, in the late 1830s, early 1840s. It's happening all the time. He said you had a better chance of being kidnapped and sold into slavery in New York than on the coast of Africa. You know, it was a great business. It was very lucrative. I mean, think of what, you know, a prime person can bring. What, $1,000? You know, your average person is making a few $100s a year. $1,000 is a huge amount of money. Talking a couple of years of you know, work. How much more? What an easy way to make money.
Well, and of course, it was illegal at that point to import slaves from Africa.
Right.
So, but it was apparently not so illegal within the United States.
Well, and of course, the thing that Ruggles was exposing was that slaves were being imported illegally, some of them through the port of New York.
Yeah.
So what he was doing was he was going on board ships, coming into New York Harbor, demanding to inspect the hold, demanding to, interview the sailors on board and so forth. And for that, he was almost, you know, kidnapped and or murdered.
Yeah.
Take your pick. Was it Brazil? Was it, you know, they surrounded his house. He managed to escape before they completely surrounded it. But, you know, they were out to get him, dead or alive. Preferably make some money off the transaction.
Thank you, Dale. I'm wondering, for people who want to do their own research on this family or other families around that time, if you could talk a little bit about some sources that you regularly use and access to those sources. For example, census records, property records, etc.
Well, one really great source, which is very easy to access, is the Black Roots in Southeastern Connecticut. That is an incredibly well-researched book. I mean, they have really sifted through the documentary evidence to an amazing. I have actually found a few things that they didn't get, but there's not a lot. I cannot believe it. They look through like Calkins Necrology. They look through probate records. They look through newspapers. They look through, you know, court records. And they managed, but it's raw material. That is, they list people, the families, and so forth. They have some speculation about, we think this person was in fact this one, but it's a good starting point, and certainly can point you at sources for information about people. And of course, I mean, the land records are just fabulous. I mean, I'll give you an example. Okay, what I did was I went through, when you went to record a deed in Norwich, they kept a book, an enrollment book, where they wrote down as it came in, the deed, you know, the volume that was being entered into, the date, who the parties were, and so forth, and sometimes in much better detail than the traditional indexes. So I went through that day book pretty carefully, trying to pick out, you know, things like.
Where's that kept? I think it's.
Well, it's right in the city clerk's office. That's right in the land records, you know. So, okay, here's volume 31, page 545, May 4th, 1785. And I did find some things that weren't in practice. The selectmen of the town of Norwich, having considered the age, abilities, and circumstances of a Negro manservant of Mr. Eleazar Jewett by the name of Cato, are of the opinion that he that said Cato may properly be emancipated agreeable to law, and the said Jewett is hereby authorized to emancipate him accordingly. Norwich, 4th May 1785. It gives the selectmen's names and the registrar's name. And then there's one that was just just great that I was really impressed by. Well, and then, but not all that stuff gets into the land records. Some of it is Christopher Leffingwell had an enslaved person named Romeo, who he emancipated in 1778. But Romeo was apparently made to sign a document that where he, in exchange for receiving his freedom, agreed to give 50 fair days of labor to Christopher Leffingwell every year for the rest of his life, whenever Christopher Leffingwell, his heirs or assigns required it of him.
Whoa.
That is not freedom. That is in no way freedom. So, you know, I begin to have a little problem with the Leffingwells. Yes, great. Revolutionary War, great guy, early industrialist, but you know, maybe he wasn't such a great person in some respects when it came to this kind of thing. You know, and I have to say, I don't know if any of you know Frank Camarda. Frank's uncle lived in the Leffingwell house like in the 1940s when it was a boarding house. He told Frank that in the basement there were slave shackles set into the stonework. Now when they moved the house, they picked it up, they moved it, the old foundation was demolished, they built a new foundation underneath it. Nothing left of the old foundation. And there's no evidence now for that. Calkins, in her History of Norwich, said that the tradition was that there were slave auctions held at the north door of the Leffingwell house. So I don't have a lot of, I think these guys were fairly typical. Let me see if I can find that. 1795, Captain Asa Peabody, master and owner of David, a Negro man slave for life, has manifested his desire to emancipate and make free his said slave. And then they find that he's in a good state of health and is about 26 years of age. They didn't make it easy. They wanted to make sure that they weren't freeing someone that would then become a charge on the town.
I think they had a requirement. They had to be at least 25 years old, and they had to be in good health, and they had to want emancipation.
Well,
And then it had to be signed off by the selectmen.
they did fence it around. They definitely fenced it around. But so you have things, you know, I mean, some of this stuff is just pathetic. Pathetic. You know, October 31st, 1820, Richard Adams grants to Cornelia Young for $5 her child called Katie, aged about 2 years and 6 months. Born while she, said Cornelia, was a slave to me, and since has been by me emancipated.
He still owned the daughter.
He's still right, because she was born while the mother was in a condition of slavery. That's why Adam Jackson was a slave. You know, his brothers and sisters were free because they were born after his mother had been freed. But Adam Jackson had been born while his mother was still enslaved, so he was a slave, and Hempstead bought him. You know, it's really, you know, stuff is, it's actually pretty upsetting. I have to say, you know, you read about these things, and then, you know, there's some of these where, you know, these folks are forced to buy back their children one by one as they can afford them, you know. It's like, okay. But there was one that was just so good that, you know, we can't find it. It was a 1777 emancipation, and it was by Anne Baldwin. She emancipated someone, and it said, because, you know, all men should be free. It's like, wow. Pretty good. So, I mean, there's those records, but there's also land records that deal with property transactions. You know, the Connecticut Historical Society has a great deal of African American related material. They've been really collecting that and providing a guide to it. Their Connecticut Historical Society has a lot of material. They've been doing similar work. So it's actually getting easier to do research in Atlanta than it was. It's just like when I first got interested in Francis Hawkins, I went down to the London County Historical Society and I tried to look at the Hawkins material. They had almost nothing. They had almost everything, but none of it had been cataloged. None of it was accessible. And they didn't volunteer the fact that they had it because the curator at the time was like, well, you know, who's interested in that stuff anyways? You know, that's not, but now there's, you know, they're really, and the internet is helping, but I really do not, I'm not a big fan of it.
Well,
Because,
yeah, finding aids may be on the internet, but the material itself hasn't been digitized, so you still have to go look.
although the Christopher Leffingwell Romeo deed is actually online through the New Haven Museum, I was astounded. I was just astounded. It was just like, a friend of mine came across it.
So is the original in their collection then?
No. Well, because Christopher Leffingwell's son actually relocated down to New Haven, and he gave most of Leffingwell's stuff and his own stuff to Australia. But some of it somehow got into New Haven Museum, and that's part of the problem. It's scattered.
Yeah.
There's no one central repository. You know, if you really want to do research, you're going to have to travel. And you know, with the Harris family, you're talking about Rhode Island, New London, Norwich,
And
New Orleans. You know,
Chicago.
Chicago. It sounds like I've already tracked down the number of people, though. I hope you've got all of their records. I mean, even,
well, I have limited, you know, resources too in terms of being able to.
no, I mean, if you have their information, their names and so
Oh,
on.
yeah. I've had
Somebody
a.
else can,
Yeah. Oh, you're right.
yeah.
So I mean, it's actually, it's daunting, but there is a lot of stuff out there. And I think the family, you know, family history is good because, you know, that's really the matrix in which all this stuff is. You know, it's in the context of your families that this material is generally saved. Yeah.
Speaking of family connections, do you have any information on Aaron Newby?
No.
Because there was a guy named Dangerfield Newby
It's with John.
died with John Brown. He was the first man killed, and he was carrying a letter from his wife.
Wife.
That was his motivation to go down, and she was about to be sold down to New Orleans. And
Right.
she wanted him to come.
They were in far Plummer County, I think.
In Virginia?
In Virginia.
Yeah, right
Yeah, so
across.
this guy was from South Carolina, so I don't think so. I don't think there was a, I mean, Newby is a fairly common name.
Right.
Um, Not around here, but in some places. You know, and two, there are, for instance, you've got the Wall Diary in New London, not always great, but around 1900 to maybe 1920, Richard Wall wrote a series of articles about New London, the old timers and the reminiscences and so forth. And while now he talks about Fairweather, but he calls him Fairbrother. No. Yeah, well, you know, sort of the folk stories that get passed on. Yeah, his name was, I don't know, Fairbrother, something like that, but sometimes that can be useful.
It's funny that you mention that, because I was looking up the records on George Fairweather, and I found in the New London City Hall vault, and I found some Fairbrothers, and I thought, well, that couldn't be him, right? It could be him. They had Fairweather spelled 2 or 3 different ways.
Yeah.
F-A-I-R, F-A-Y-R.
Good evening, the library is closing tonight at 8 o'clock.
Well,
So that's the warning.
yeah. Well, you know, yeah, I mean, there's just, there's a vast amount of material.
I'll send you to say Richard
No, I wrote a series of articles for the day.
for the day, but is that combined anywhere?
What happened was, the scrapbook of all those clippings was placed in the New London County Historical System. And there is an index to the scrapbook that refers to the page on the scrapbook. Yeah. It's on microfilm. Unfortunately, the first 30 or 40 microfilm pages have, but the original is still there, but they won't let you, well, they would let you see it in the past, and right now.
They haven't digitized those yet?
No. They haven't digitized.
So there's no way to really have access.
Oh, no, you can go in, you can look at the
Oh, you can look.
index, and then you go to the microfilm, you go to the page on the microfilm, and there's the article.
Oh, okay.
Unless you're...
Unless it's in the first few, but the ones that are relevant to that are like page 113,
Oh, okay.
549, whatever, you know. Yeah, so, and it's useful, I think, because it gives you these sort of stories that sometimes shed a little light on what people were thinking, you know. So he tells us, and this is about African Americans, he tells a story about Elder Swan in the Baptist church. You know, Reverend Dodge comes in, who's a Universalist, and sits down in the church, and you know, he curses him, and apparently Dodge has a stroke. So you know that curse comes true. And there's another story where he had one of the deacons. Whenever he was making a point, Swan would say, "Isn't that so, Elder Smith?" And Smith would say, "Yes, Reverend Swan, that's so." So one day he says, "Elder Smith, if God called," he was talking about the sacrifice of Isaac, "if God called on you to sacrifice your little Becky, you'd do it, wouldn't you?" So Elder Smith says, "Well," he says, "I'd have to think about that a little bit, Reverend Swan." You know, but I mean, they give you the sort of flavor of things that is, you know.
Thank you so much, Dale. This is
Okay,
great.
sorry to go on.
Thank you.
You dropped something.
Oh, yeah, probably.
One answer that did appear was